we'll start with some introductions. Before we begin, my name is Maria. I'm the Director of Development at the Seward House Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for another one of our live streamed programs. Tonight, we have a really fun evening in store as part of our ongoing monthly couples spotlight. We are examining William and Frances Seward this week. If you've seen our posts and have been following along, you'll know that we started off with Judge Miller and his wife Hannah. This week is William and Frances Seward. Next week, we're going to look at Seward's son Fred and his wife Anna. And then to finish off the month, Seward's other son, Will Jr., and his wife Janet. But tonight, for our spotlight on William and Frances Seward, we're going to have our live dramatic reading, look at their life and their marriage through the many letters that they wrote to each other. So joining me tonight is our Director of Education, Jeff Ledwig, Coralie Hunter, who will be portraying Mrs. Seward for us, and Jack Sherman, who will be portraying Mr. Seward for this evening's presentation. So Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thanks, as you say, to everyone tuning in. Happy early Valentine's Day. Even if you're not one for this holiday, I think you'll enjoy tonight's program where we examine one of the 19th century's more interesting political marriages, that between William Henry Seward and Frances Miller Seward. As we'll discuss tonight, they spent a lot of their marriage apart, which was often a burden, but for us in the 21st century, something of a blessing because we have access to the hundreds of letters they sent to each other through the many years and many miles that separated them. As we'll see tonight, these letters are often full of fondness, love, affection, politics, often tension, anger, resentment. So in other words, a marriage. And we've had to make some hard choices tonight. 41 years is a lot of ground to cover. We'd like this program to go about an hour. So we've tried to select some representative samples that are facsimiles of imagined conversations taking place between these letters. And we've divided tonight up into about a half dozen different time periods. Some of them are also thematic. We'll begin early in the couple's marriage and go all the way through the end of the Civil War. I'll pop up between these sections and just do a little contextualization, allowing Mr. and Mrs. Seward to stay in character. A housekeeping item is that we are very grateful and thankful to all the work being done at the University of Rochester and the Seward Project, a great effort at the digital humanities that makes these letters possible. And in fact, if you're following at home tonight and you want to read the original letters or see in the original hand, you can do that. SewardProject.org. Mr. and Mrs. Seward will say what year and date of each letter, so date and month and year. And you can search the database by sender and by year, so you could hop right on and read. If you're doing that, you will probably notice that they will not be doing verbatim letters tonight. These letters were often quite long, sometimes 7, 8, 9 pages with very small handwriting. We've made a couple of editorial choices that you won't hear or see, but we want to acknowledge that we've used ellipses and brackets for smoothness and to do a little condensing. But we'd encourage you, read the originals in full, and in a very few cases tonight, we have pulled letters from Mr. Seward's 3-volume autobiography to complete conversations. The Seward Project is ongoing, and their efforts continue to bear fruit year by year. We begin tonight early in the marriage of the Sewards, and I don't want to assume that anyone listening tonight knows the story as well as we feel that we do. So a brief introduction seems to be in order. William Henry Seward, born in 1801 in Florida, New York, off to Union College at just 15, graduates at 19 and 1820, top of his class, law degree. And it's not long after that that he makes a charming young acquaintance, Frances Miller Seward, born 1805 in Auburn, New York. As a little girl, she grew up in what we know today as the Seward House Museum, attends the Troy Female Seminary in Troy, New York. One of her classmates, Cornelia Seward, fatefully introduces about a 15 or 16-year-old Frances to a 19 or 20-year-old Henry, as we'll hear him called tonight. He moves to Auburn in 1822. They court, wed in 1824, and at her father's insistence, move in to his home with him and raise a family. You're going to hear a lot of the names of the children tonight. They would have 5. You'll hear names of siblings. If you don't know them, we've tried to bracket in some introductory details, but you can go to the Seward Project, click on these names, learn more about this world. This is just a sampler tonight, just a taste for a larger meal that could be yours. Seward and Frances are together for the first few years. By the later 1820s, Mr. Seward is making his way into politics. He'll spend nearly half a century in public life. And as we enter their relationship, he's just about to begin that journey in 1829.
June 1829. My dear Henry, I have just received your second letter, and I am very sorry to hear that you have been sick one day. I hope it's not a prelude to a more serious indisposition. Remember your promise to send for me if you are ill. I shall be alarmed if I do not hear from you every post. Mordant, but I suppose I should be called foolishly romantic should I say this to anyone else. I was provoked with my friend Serene once because she said she did not admire Washington Irving's wife in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon because there never could be in real life such an occurrence. The description was much too exaggerated. By the way, you do not let the family see my letters, do you? I am afraid, as Gus says, they will think some part of them exceedingly silly. I must finish this letter in a hurry as the mail goes out this afternoon. I cannot hear from you again until next Monday. It seems a long time. Do not for the world discontinue writing in your present manner. I like it of all things you know. Many little occurrences which transpire during the day would seem unimportant and too trifling to relate did you defer writing until the next. But everything that happens in which you are concerned will always interest me. So continue in the way you have began. I will do likewise. Tell Lizette and Clary I am expecting answers to my letters. Augustus talks of writing Pa a letter every time he sees me engaged in that way. For Sarah's information, do tell me what Harry Schooley said about Aunt Patty's house. Was it burned? Your own, Frances.
January 21st, 1831. The bright moon is pouring her silver rays upon me, just as she is pouring out of the abundance of the same treasure upon you, though distant from me so many long miles. My window opens to the east, and I have stood half frozen at the casement, looking at the sober moon and thinking how many a happy evening we have watched it through the window in the room where you now are. I even fancy Augustus, fatigued with the arduous duties of the day, having gone to sleep to dream of the pomp and circumstance of the parade ground, and Fred, hushed into the sweet and undisturbed sleep of infancy, while you are writing the lines which shall cross these upon the road.
19 April 1832. My dear Henry, you speak of retirement from active life, of abandoning politics and the law. It is unnecessary to say how happy such retirement would once have made me, would still make me, but it may not be. No flatterer, Henry, least of all to you I speak insincerely, but it is obvious, be your merits what they may, that you are the pride and hope of your parents and kindred. The best of any who would once have pointed to a different path is more likely to secure peace of mind. But the time has gone by, and though my own views remain unchanged, I cannot find it in my heart to advise a course which would mar the happiness of so many who love you kindly, if not so well, as your own Frances. I must still content myself with dreaming of the realization of my wishes, and 'tis all but a dream at the best. Your own Frances.
young love, William and Frances in the early years of their marriage, in their 20s, beginning a pattern that would continue for decades. Mr. Seward would enter politics in 1830, serving a term in the New York State Senate. At the end of that term, running unsuccessfully for governor in 1834. We can already see some of the tensions building. Mrs. Seward acknowledging openly in the spirit of these letters that she might have made a different choice, but she's no flatterer, and she understands, or at least accepts for now, that Henry is to be pulled away, the pride of so many. In the middle of that term, Mr. Seward would absent himself in the summer of 1833 and go on a trip abroad with his father, leaving Frances and their first two young children, Augustus and Fred, whom you've heard mentioned, in Auburn with Mrs. Seward, and they correspond during this time.
Summer 1833. My dear Henry, yesterday, after finishing my letter to you and writing to your brother Jennings and your friend Tracy, I was too much fatigued to write any more. Did not attend church. The day was rainy and unpleasant. Aunt Clary went after tea up to Lizette's, found her some better. Dr. Pitney and Beardsley were here in the evening. Your letters were called for, and Beardsley read the first aloud for the edification of Pa. I can hardly make you sensible how much excitement the arrival of your letters produced. I am nearly as much congratulated as I was at the time of our marriage. Your letters were very, very interesting and will be read over and over again until the arrival of some others. I almost wished myself with you. Remember that you cannot describe anything too minutely to interest me. 1,000 trifles, which might be deemed unimportant to others, will have attractions in my eyes from the circumstances of your being the narrator and their having transpired in a foreign land. I had not heard until last evening, and then accidentally, what was your intended route. I supposed you would go immediately to London. Mr. Watson said you would go to Edinburgh, and Peter said you would go to Cork. Pa decided in favor of Peter's country by referring your letter to him. So, my next letter will be from the Emerald Isle. Well, I have not Grandma's prejudices against the Irish, and so be glad to hear from that country of warm hearts and generous impulses. Only think to you, dearest, who are never absent from my mind, to whom I devote the first hour in the morning, to whom I would most gladly send a letter every day. You are very, very good to devote so much of your time to writing to me. You must necessarily be very much hurried, but I am so much more happy now. I can hear from you if the time is long between the writing and arrival of letters. Frances.
June 1833, Glasgow, Scotland. My dear Frances, we awoke on Friday morning at the wharf, or as it is here called, the quays of Glasgow. Multitudes of steamboats and sloops of a second-rate size filled the narrow channel of the Clyde, which is here about 10 rods wide, and has its banks lined with masonry so that it resembles a large canal. The long, compact rows of firm, lofty stone buildings told us at once that we were lying in the center of a great town, while the names of the inns on shore and the boats in the river gave assurance that we were among a people who, above all others, cherish their poets and scholars. Nor was it without a thrill of pleasure that, among these spontaneous twists of enlightened popular feeling, I saw a similar one in the names of Washington Street and Washington Inn. Glasgow is closely connected in commercial intercourse with New York, and the good feeling which pervades society here towards America is perhaps no more than a just return for the veneration and respect universally exhibited in our country for Scottish literature and genius. We are now upon classic ground, It recalls the recollections of all that we have read about Scotland, whether of history or fiction. But as my time is limited, so that I must husband minutes to relate to you the wonders which I am allowed but a few hours to see, I will throw aside all sentiment and enthusiasm and give you a tame chapter of facts. Like all European towns we have yet seen, Glasgow wears a dark and somber aspect. The buildings are of stone, and although of good proportion and excellent material, they appear very different from the light, airy brick edifices of our American cities. We dined with our friend Dr. Anschencloss. Now, the guests were 4 gentlemen of Glasgow, men of science and talent. The dinner was got up in Caledonian style. A twist broth, as they call their kale soup, then a dram of Scotch whiskey, after which a glass of wine. Next, boiled salmon and turbot, then another dram of Scotch whiskey, then meat dishes, and a third dram of Scotch whiskey, then the dessert, after which wine, which was soon removed, and a punch bowl was then set before the oldest burgher with the ingredients for making hot punch. It would be only courteous and just to say that this gentleman acquitted himself of his duty to a charm. We left the table at 9, well pleased with Scotland and ourselves and the world.
Seward would return to Mrs. Seward safely at the end of that trip, and in 1834, the following year, their 10th wedding anniversary would see his term end and his unsuccessful run for the New York governorship. It would also see perhaps the low point of their marriage, where the strain of so much time away would come home to roost, and Mr. and Mrs. Seward suffered a schism that nearly resulted in calamity.
November 28th, 1834, Monday morning, 7 o'clock. My beloved and faithful one, I have been during the last 2 days and nights waking from a long, feverish, and almost fatal dream, fatal to my love and mine and your happiness. Even yet my mind is bewildered and my heart convulsed. It is now that I know the truth of what you have so often and with bitter tears doubted, and that I with cruel and unfeeling recklessness have censured you for doubting, that unworthy as I am, I still love you. But how nearly has that love been banished from my heart, and your happiness and mine been shipwrecked? Oh, how much precious time for love has been irrecoverably lost. How much suffering have I caused you which can never be atoned for? What a demon is this ambition! With such powerful emotions I have during the last 1, 2, 4, oh, heaven knows, almost 10 years, save 1 or 2 of the years your destiny has been interwoven with mine, been led away in thought, purpose, communion, and sympathy from the only being who purely loves me, and the only altar at which happiness could be obtained. I shudder now to retrace the past. I have listened unheeded, nay, turned from you with pity for your feminine weakness, when you reminded me, this, Henry, is the anniversary of our marriage. And do you remember, loved one, this is the birthday of our firstborn? I banished you from my heart. I made it so desolate, so destitute of sympathy for you, of everything which you ought to have found there, that you could no longer dwell in it. And when the wretched Tracy took advantage of my madness and offered sympathies and feelings and love such as I had sworn, and your expelled heart was half won by his falsehoods, still I did not know and see that I was criminal. God be praised for the escape of both of us from that fearful peril. You must know that when I left home, I was, as I had been for months before, the slave of ambition. This passion remained in full control of all my thoughts and purposes after, as well as before, the event which determined so much of our destiny. Now, I have had time to reflect upon the values of that treasure I possess, and to repent of the wrongs and injustice I have done to you. Loved, injured, and angel spirit, receive this homage of my first return to reason and truth. Say to me that, understanding my own feelings, yours are not crushed. Kiss my dear boys, and believe me ever yours, and only yours, and that I now feel ineffably desirable it would be that forever might be eternal.
December 1834. Dear Henry, I have been thinking of you, my dearest, constantly since I received your last letter. It awakened so many feelings which I have endeavored to bury in forgetfulness, that I'm not sure now that my mind is sufficiently regulated to render what I may write intelligible. You reproach yourself, dear Henry, with too much severity. Never in those times when I have wept the most bitterly over the decay of my young dreams, when my heart has been most oppressed with the want of sympathy, have I thought you otherwise than good and kind. When I thought we were differently constituted, when I realized most forcibly that love is the whole history of woman and but an episode in the life of man, when I at last came to believe that I had deceived myself from the beginning and that you were incapable of experiencing the deep and enduring love which made me so miserable, even then I imputed it not to give you as a fault, but reproached myself for wishing to exact a return for affections which I felt were more intense. If I could not conceal from you my sorrow in losing my influence over a heart I once thought so entirely my own, I could not, when I looked on the bright faces of our precious boys and thought of the numerous blessings still left me, conceal from myself that this incessant repining was sinful. Do you remember my saying to you last winter that I could never love another better than yourself unless God utterly deserted me? He did not desert me, but he made me sensible of the weakness of all human virtues, of the insufficiency of all human wisdom to keep us in the bright path without a humble reliance on his strength to assist us. And now, my own Henry, if you can give me the love for which my heart has so often yearned, if you will not resist or neglect the kindly influence of this spirit, if you will consent to make the praise and honor of erring mortals but a secondary object of ambition, I trust we may yet be more happy than in the earliest and brightest days of our union. I am impatient to hear from you again and hope with trembling that your feelings remain the same as when you last wrote. As ever, your own, Frances.
December 8th, 1834. My dearest friend, I have always loved you as the best and chief of my affections. I have been led afar off by an ambition which has only this mitigation, that it was neither sordid nor selfish. I now see clearly that I must not hope to preserve your love in the measure necessary to my happiness if my own heart and character grow more worldly while yours become more and more pure and heavenly. I would now, as I always would, be unwilling to ask or expect your love, but by endeavoring to be worthy of it. Your love can be my guide, my support in producing the state of mind and feeling proper for asking that grace, which is indispensable to the first step. Does that love continue strong enough to undertake the task and to preserve it? I feel the necessity for its aid. I feel at this moment, as I have all along, that if this important change is to be wrought in my heart, I must, in a humble and not irreverent sense, owe it to you. And now, dearest, we part for another night. There is one less day between us.
Did you follow what was going on there in those letters? Quite a lot to unpack. Mr. and Mrs. Seward are having a deep and difficult conversation while not being in the same room, not for the last time, of what Henry's ambition has wrought. In this case, the distance, traveling the world without her, not for the last time. The dread demon ambition, drawing him increasingly away from her into politics to the point of neglect, cutting off his heart from her, being cold. And all of this culminating in perhaps an emotional affair or an inappropriate relationship between Mrs. Seward and the dreaded Tracy, Albert Tracy, a one-time friend of Mrs. Seward, Mr. Seward, who tried to keep company in some way with Mrs. Seward during this time. They escaped by the narrowest of margins, their marriage foundering. Seward would return to Auburn after losing the election of 1834, run again for governor in 1838, win this election, and serve 2 terms as a Whig governor. We have very few letters from this period to draw from on the Seward Project just now, so we're going to jump forward well into time. You heard Mr. Seward say to his wife that her love could be his guide. The two would try to keep union together through the mails, as in 1848, in a national year for the Whig Party, Seward would be elevated to the U.S. Senate, taking his seat in early 1849. So we leave them behind 1834, where he was 30, she was 26, and now we find Seward taking a national stage, having made a name for himself as governor of New York, and Mrs. Seward back in Auburn, the chain of mail of letters reignited, and they discuss many things. He using her for counsel, guidance, wisdom, encouragement. Foremost on their minds, however, and in their mail, is that great crisis driving a wedge into this country during a decade of sectional crisis and tension, the issue of slavery. And here we find Mr. and Mrs. Seward are of one mind and relying strongly on each other as they try to combat it as best they can.
27 January 1849. My dear Henry, I have many kind letters from you beside that which I received this morning, dated Wednesday. I cannot conceive why my letters are so much longer getting to you than yours to me. Your last came in 2 days. I should have written at least 3 days ago, but have been very busy preparing for a small party. People seem to be just awakening to the consciousness that you are a benevolent man and have many estimable qualities, a discovery which I made at least 25 years ago. The commendations of your Baltimore speech in the National Whig are as warm as they are well-deserved. Ever your own, Frances.
Senate Chamber, March 8th, 1849. My dearest Frances, your illness hangs like a cloud upon my spirits. I cannot be cheerful when you are ill or sad. Yesterday, in the Senate, with closed doors, I tried the firmness of my head and feet by replying to John C. Calhoun, who spoke against the confirmation of the Postmaster General on the ground of his imputed favor of the bill for abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. I was short, and I intended to show that I was uncompromising in my opposition to slavery, but at the same time, calmly firm in my intention to abide by the Union and to practice the necessary moderation to save the Union and to accomplish whatever was attainable. My remarks were listened to with attention and curiosity, of course. I think they left a good impression upon candid and fair men, while they were regarded with favor by the very few bold and decided men of the North. It was painful to see, I may say in unity to you, the subservient timidity of the senators, with few exceptions, on the subject in secret session, but not at all alarming to find myself the boldest and freest of them all. It's a great thing to have gotten over the panic which I always feel arriving to speak on a new stage, and I regard it as very fortunate that the occasion called me out, although a new member, and this very first effort was made without an audience. The Senate is adjourned, and I have been trying to write this letter in my seat, thinking that I could find more leisure there than in my own bedroom. But it is a sad procession, and if it shall continue, I do not know how I am ever to find time for study. I called last night, among other places, at the White House, and I assure you it was delightful to find a warm place, both in the council chamber and in the parlor. President Taylor is a man to be loved. Ever your own, Henry. Charleston, Wednesday morning, May 2nd, 1849. My dearest Frances, we are under a burning sky and upon a red-hot earth here. It is next to impossible to go abroad after 10 in the morning, unless one can be protected by the shade of an overhanging wall. What are you doing? What are you thinking? What are you thinking of a truant husband like me? Here I am, lounging or studying away in the mornings and dining away the evenings, not yet having reached my cause on the calendar, and you are left among strangers, sick, I fear, in a strange city. When I see near enough to make the inquiry important, I shall inquire by telegraph for you to ascertain where I shall look for my wife and child on my way home. It is clear enough that South Carolina is as overwhelmingly opposed to the Wilmot Proviso as the North is in favor of that great policy of humanity, and even more so. I was quite surprised this morning on taking up the newspapers to find that the hospitable, intelligent, and generous men with whom I was dining every day, oblivious of political differences, constituted the Committee of Vigilance and Public Safety to see that the South resists the encroachment, as they called it, even to blood. Your own faithful Henry.
July 1850. My dear Henry, I have been intending to write every day. I have not read Mr. Clay's speech. It came last evening. I do not like him as I used to do. His speeches are divested of much of their former interest. I am sorry the compromise is to pass, but anticipated a change when our good President Taylor died, when I saw your vote standing alone. I suppose there are few men who bear such tests well. I thought a plan which had the approval of General Taylor would not fail to meet his approbation. I see there is no calculation to be made upon the action of politicians, save one. You say nothing about your health, so I hope you are better. I would willingly be spared the journey to Washington this summer. Was that sense love? Your own, Frances.
February 18 and 19, 1854. My dearest Frances, I do not know how well or ill I have done the necessary work, for I have not yet read the speech for freedom and public faith as a whole. But the measure of success which shall crown our exertions must depend, now as heretofore, on the fidelity with which the people whom we represent shall adhere to the principles which are the foundation of their own greatness. I may venture to tell you that some happy spell seemed to myself to have come over me, and to have enabled me to speak with more freedom and ease than on any former occasion here. What you have so long to wish for has come around at last. The Whigs of the North are separated from the Whigs of the South. The storm that is rising is such a one as this country has never yet seen. God grant that it may leave us a united and a more free and virtuous people.
February 1854. Dear Henry, I am just recovering from illness induced by reading your speech Sunday. It was a great and good speech and cannot have had a bad effect upon anyone whose brain is in a less irritable state than mine. I agree with Weed in thinking you men now made a stronger argument. I will write more when stronger.
Yes, in the 1850s, Senator and Mrs. Seward were often in alignment, their minds working together. He solicitous of her opinion, she strong with words of praise and encouragement. As Henry went to Washington and gave speech after speech condemning slavery, speaking of higher laws, irrepressible conflicts, the coming storm, as he mentions here, in many instances, she could not have been prouder of her husband and often went to Washington to be there, for as she put it, it was well to be with Henry as he stood often alone, confronting the institution of slavery. By the later 1850s, it was becoming clear that Mr. Seward represented a great hope for a new Republican Party and its chances of winning the presidency in 1860. Mr. Seward sought that nomination and was unsuccessful. Defeated by that dark horse outsider, or little lawyer as he called him, Abraham Lincoln, Seward watched as Lincoln took the White House, and that crisis that he'd long been watching engulfed the nation. He was tapped to become President Lincoln's Secretary of State, and he and Mrs. Seward resumed their correspondence, now on the eve of civil war, right before Lincoln's inauguration, and Seward, to his wife's lament, begins to become more of a compromiser, seeking ways to preserve union. We'll follow their correspondence from this disagreement all the way through to war's end.
19 January 1861. My dearest Henry, eloquent as your speech was, it fails to meet the entire approval of those who love you best. The wish so often expressed by your friends that you had not spoken at all, the commendations of only conservative papers, and the silence or exultance of those which are unfriendly, all point to the same lesson. You are in danger of taking the path which led Daniel Webster to an unhonored grave 10 years ago. Compromise is based on the idea that the preservation of the Union is more important than the liberty of nearly 4 million human beings cannot be right. The alteration of the Constitution to perpetuate slavery, the enforcement of a law to recapture a poor, suffering fugitive, giving half of the frontier of a free country to the curse of slavery. These compromises cannot be approved by God or supported by good men. Whatever may be the judgment of this generation, in the end gained now, in ages to come, this truth will stand out boldly on the pages of history. No one can dread war more than I do. For 10 years, I have prayed earnestly that our son might be spared the misfortune of raising his hand against his fellow man. Yet I could not today assent to the perpetuation or extension of slavery to prevent war. I say this in no spirit of unkindness. God knows I fail to see my own path clearly often enough to make me charitable to the wanderings of others. But I must obey the admonition of conscience, which impels me to warn you of your danger. I fear to hear your name execrated by the humane and generous, as I hear of your chief counselor now. May God protect and guide you. Your own, Frances.
January 1861. I'm not surprised that you do not like the concessions in my speech. You will soon enough come to see that they are not compromises, but explanations to disarm the enemies of truth, freedom, and union of their most effective weapons. I'm trying to get home, but as yet I see no chance. I am the only hopeful and conciliatory person here. Madmen North and madmen South are working together to produce a dissolution of the Union by civil war. What I say and do is said and done not in view of personal objects, but of such fearful responsibilities. And I, in this case, above all others, am looking, or rather leaving, to posterity to decide upon my action and conduct.
7 June 1861. My dearest Henry, your letter of Wednesday came last evening. We are continually thinking of you and trying to ascertain how much of all we see in the public journals about the danger or safety of Washington is true. The people here are hoping for a call for more troops, thinking it is better to have too many than too few. I dreamed last night that we were all together in the Capitol at Washington when it was blown up with powder. Of course, the explosion awoke me, and I could not tell whether we escaped or were buried in the ruins. I see no evidence that other European governments than England are in favor of our dismemberment, but are no longer incredulous on the subject of a lack of good faith anywhere, since England has failed. I begin to despair of seeing any of you home this summer. When I am sure you are not coming, I must write some of the things I wished to say. Love to the children. May God preserve you all. Your own, Frances.
Department of State, Washington, June 15th, 1863. My dearest Frances, your letter of the 12th has just come. I have this moment telegraphed William that it is best for him to return to his regiment. General Lee has, as I know you have already learned, crossed the Rappahannock, and the military operations are now to open in our immediate vicinity. You will not infer that there is any increase of danger for any of us in this change. We were already sufficiently near to suffer by possible defeats, even when the war was on the south side of the Rappahannock. There is a consolation for me, however, in knowing that the women and small children whom God has placed under my care are so far from all the scenes of strife. Affectionately, your own, Henry. Washington, July 9th, 1863. My dearest Frances, I received last night your letter of the 5th. The newspapers have, since it was written, possessed you of all the military and political information I have, though I know very well how difficult you must find the task of separating the real from the exaggeration. The battles at Gettysburg were the severest of the war, perhaps the severest that ever were fought. They closed without the healing up of the offending army. The losses were full 1 third of its whole force. It returned, and although it suffered in the retreat, it is still a strong army, retaining its infernal enjoying of destruction. Our army has been recovering from the conflicts at Gettysburg. The great losses there have been repaired by reinforcements from Baltimore, Washington, Harrisburg, and other points, so that in numbers, it is probably greater than it was when it met the enemy, and I think exceeds his rank and file. The reinforcements, material, and supplies are arriving with much difficulty over obstructed roads, the rains having rendered movement in every direction almost impossible. The enemy cannot withdraw. He must fight, and doubtless will fight desperately. We are without fear. But you know how we learn ourselves into confidence, notwithstanding battles so often disrupt the best calculations. The intelligence from the West is improving, and the nation has much ground to hope that the meaningful conflict is coming to an auspicious end. We all are well. Your own, Henry. Department of State, Washington, Thanksgiving, 1863. My dearest Frances, in the hurry of disposing of 2 weeks' foreign mails, I seem to myself to have been inattentive to your letters, and Fanny's detailing from day to day the pains, troubles, and apprehension of our own household, in which everyone was suffering from sickness. It is a bright and balmy morning. The department is closed. We have excellent news from Grant. No one knows how wearisome this dealing with war is to me. I have little of the passions, I think, that make war, even when successful, a pleasurable excitement. If I endure it better than many, I think it is because I regard it as an evil that could not be avoided, and that is appointed by a mysterious providence for discipline and motivation. Every day, however, I find myself asking the question, cannot I now leave it to others and be exempt from the consciousness of having shrunk from a proper duty? Your own, Henry.
18 June 1864. My dearest Henry, your letter to Fanny, which came last evening, dissipated our anticipation of a visit from you about this time. We wish very much to have you see the garden before this July sun pales the verdure and withers the flowers. I work all the time and write. Housework distracts my thoughts, which is a relief just now. Today is our Will's birthday. He is 25 years old. May God preserve him through the perils of this year. The late movement of the Army, we suppose, must indicate that some of the Confederacy is more easily approached from the south. But Grant keeps his plans to himself much less than usual. Lizette, after a sick week, is better again. I wrote to Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I have a letter from Will dated the 6th of June. He was well then. Love to the children, your own Frances.
Again, everyone, we've been skimming from the surface of these letters to give you a sense of what lies within this great archive. This war, of which you can see Mr. Seward drawing weary, does come to a close in April 1865. On April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant, and the remaining pockets of resistance are confronted deeper and deeper into the South and Southwest. On April 14th, 1865, however, President Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater, and as most friends of the Seward House Museum know, Mr. Seward was assailed by a co-conspirator in his Washington home, doors down from the White House, where he was viciously stabbed in bed by a would-be assassin, Lewis Powell. Two of Mr. Seward's grown sons, Augustus and Frederick were also severely injured, as well as servants and a body man. Mrs. Seward was at home at the time, an eyewitness of this bloodbath, as was their young daughter, Fanny. And in the days and weeks that followed, she tried to care for her husband and her sons. Her own health began to decline as Mr. Seward's improved. And our last letter tonight comes from some of their last days together, him now caring for her.
Department of State, Washington, June 1st, 1865. My dear sister, I have at last got my right arm free and have some holding of other limbs, and members have gathered at my table in the department for the present time. Time brings the healing, so gratifying to a sick man to express to you my thoughts in all their fullness, for your having come here in your frail health to look after us in our trouble. I hope the journey has not impaired your strength, and I continually inquire what is heard from you. Frederick's care is very trying. His arteries do not seem willing to close, yet each hemorrhage is less serious than the preceding one and seems scarcely to hinder his recovery. We only see that time passes and he is still so suffering and apparently not out of the danger of a fatal relapse. His mother seems to darken under her anxieties. I am disturbed about her with every check, as I am moving on with efforts slowly toward convalescence. Your affectionate brother, William H. Seward.
And with that, we have reached the conclusion of our letters and of tonight's program. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If you're interested in reading more letters between William and Frances or other members of the Seward family, you can visit sewardproject.org. You're able to search by sender or by receiver or in other different ways. So there's just a great wealth of information and archive there. Coming up for the Seward House Museum, we are continuing our spotlight this week on William and Frances Seward. Tomorrow, we will have a short curator talk video that we'll be posting done by our Director of Collections, Emily, to look at some items that we have in the house that belong to William and Frances. And then this weekend, Sunday on Valentine's Day, we will be posting a pre-recorded lecture by Shelley Clark, who is a PhD candidate of history at the University of Rochester. She's going to be delving even deeper into the relationship of William and Frances Seward, and also looking at the institutions of gender and marriage in the 19th century. So we have a lot of exciting programs still yet to come. But thank you tonight to Jeff for your commentary, which was really helpful, and to Jack and Corley for your wonderful readings of all of these letters. So thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Feel free to watch later to comment any questions that you have after the fact, and we will do our best to answer those. But until we meet again, we will say goodnight.